Okay, so this is part 2 of my lesson plan for Charity. So I stopped at concept number 32, just in the list that I'm going in, not in the order that we have it on our 100 concepts list. So number 33, the frontal lobe, because it has to do with problem solving, this is going to be kind of useful when it comes to Charity figuring out how to do things on her own by the do one in the see one, do one, teach one. The occipital lobe will come in handy when she is watching me do it the first time, and the temporal lobe will be important as she's listening to my instructions as I go through it the first time. I think it's parietal lobe? I'm not really sure how to say that. The parietal lobe. We're going to go with that. I don't know. It pretty much just covers all of the above. Her motor cortex is also going to have a lot to do with her ability to solve the problems on her own while she's doing it on her own, because filling the crack in the windshield takes motor skills. And then the limbic system, the thalamus, the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, and the amygdala, they're all going to be important to her performing the task, because the thalamus passes information to the cerebral cortex, and the hippocampus, because it transfers information from short-term to long-term memory, it'll be stimulated by the see one, do one, teach one method of teaching, and the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus, because it has to do with like pleasure and rage, the crack will inspire the latter, and fixing the crack will inspire the former. And then the amygdala, because it has to do with emotions and emotional behavior, will probably, I'll be able to teach her a little bit about how she can feel frustrated sometimes when things happen and she can't control them, like a rock hitting a windshield. Neurons and neuron components, as well as glial cells, all have to do with the transmission of information, so basically moving what I teach her from her short-term memory into her long-term memory, and I've got a couple different strategies in order to transfer that information effectively. Plasticity, because it has to do with increasing her ability to recall information and making information more long-term. Teaching will increase her plasticity. When she teaches someone else to do it, the ability to fix the windshield will move from doing to knowing. And myelination also has to do with transmission, which I talked about right before plasticity. Cooperative learning, so she and I are going to teach someone else how to fix different types of cracks. And so she will be working with me in a small group to teach another person in our group. So there will be small groups involved in this teaching process. Jerome Bruner, because he was responsible for inquiry-based learning, and that also goes along with discovery learning. That's kind of what this is. She's going to be figuring things out kind of on her own. I'm going to be giving her a basic overview of what we'll be doing, but she'll have to work through some of those problems that she encounters on her own, as she will have to do in a real-world situation. You know, there's not always going to be someone there to hold her hand and walk her through it, and she'll be able to figure out how to do things based on pulling information from prior knowledge. Carol Gilligan, The Ethics of Care. I think one of the things that this will relate well to is that she has a responsibility to others to be honest and to help. So if there's ever a crack if she ever causes a crack in someone else's windshield, she has a responsibility to others to let them know. If she sees someone struggling on the side of the road, she has a responsibility to help them, things like that. Extinction has a lot to do with conditioning, so I'll talk about extinction a little bit later. Intermittent reinforcement. I'm going to allow her to build self-efficacy by letting her know she's doing well periodically, or letting her know that things can be fixed. So making sure that there are no misconceptions or over or under generalizations about how she's performing, that her self-efficacy is high, but also accurate. Norm versus criterion reinforcement test. I didn't really think that was applicable. We're not really doing a written test. It's going to be more motor focused. Hot cognition. This is going to come in handy when I talk about the moral aspects of fixing a windshield. So how we may get nervous when we've broken someone else's windshield, and crack or damage to a car in general has a tendency to inspire some negative feelings in us, and we're going to learn to set aside our negative emotions because we know how to solve the problem. Self-regulation, this will be important as we go throughout the lesson, and I'll talk about why a little bit later. Learned helplessness. So because I am following this see one, do one, teach one strategy, we're going to avoid learned helplessness because more times than not, she's going to be doing it by herself on her own with just instruction if she's really stuck from me. But I'm not going to be like, oh no, you're doing it wrong, and like sneak in and fix it for her. She's going to do that herself. The imaginary audience, I think one of the ways that I'm going to do that is set up an environment. I was originally planning on maybe going to one of the shops here on campus, but I don't want her to feel uncomfortable being surrounded by people that all know what they're doing. Also, that would be uncomfortable for me too, because, we're not experts at it. So we don't want to make her feel like she's being watched or judged by experts, and also trying to help her forget that the camera's there by just engaging her like we're not being videotaped. Constructivism. I think I'm going to talk to her a little bit about what fixing a cracked windshield teaches you about life. There's a lot of analogies of, once something's cracked, you can't fix it, but the cracked windshield can be fixed, it can be filled in, and you can hardly notice that there's a crack there anymore. So, personal fable, I'm gonna let her know that despite what she may believe, it will happen to her at one point or another. I think we all have a tendency to believe, oh, that'll never happen to me. So I'm gonna fix that personal fable. And then Vygotsky, how does the culture affect our environment? Basically, where we live, I guess, how it affects the types of problems with the windshield that we'll come into. I'm not really sure about Vygotsky, to be perfectly honest. I thought that was pretty much what it was, but... And then the zone of proximal development also goes along with C1, do one, teach one. C1 is the outer zone, do one is the middle zone, and teach one is the inner zone. So moving from, not being able to do something to be able to do something so well that you can teach it true understanding. And then disequilibrium and equilibrium, we're going to try to bring everything together so that all of these different components and all these different elements mesh into one basic principle for fixing a windshield. Assimilation, basically just kind of figuring out what do you know how to fix already. Have you ever had like a pot that broke, or a glass, or drawing connections and kind of explaining the differences and the similarities. And then accommodation is just adapting to a new situation, and car maintenance is pretty much new for anybody who's a new driver, so just figuring out how to adapt. And then Piaget and the cognitive stages of development. One of the things that I'm going to kind of focus on is, if she sees the resin dripping from the canister, kind of question, so what does that mean? What's happening? And I'm not going to answer that question for her. I'm going to let her kind of figure that out on her own, because she's in the cognitive stage where she can ask what's happening, what is this connected to. And then expository instruction and direct instruction. I'm going to be doing more direct instruction than expository instruction. And the most direct instruction will be when I'm teaching about the different types of cracks and chips in the windshield. And Albert Bandera talks a lot about self-efficacy, and so I already covered self-efficacy a little bit earlier. And then Howard Gardner talks about visual and spatial understandings, verbal and linguistic understandings, and then bodily and kinesthetic understandings. And those that's not all he talks about, but those are the three that we're going to be focusing on. Visually, she's going to have to watch me how to do it. verbally she's going to have to listen to me do it and explain how to do it to someone else, and then bodily and kinesthetically she's going to have to do it herself.